I've got 48 pages of Orthodox Daniel exposition with me. What you got?
I thought it started at 9, so I was here really early.
Well, we're doomed.
It's not me.
About to find out.
No.
Nope.
Oh, wait, is it yours? It's yours.
Hey!
Thank you, thank you. It feels good to be 30. It's good. Yeah.
For the 45th time.
Does that now automatically make you the oldest one here?
What's that?
We
Are you
stole your
automatically
thunder.
the oldest one now?
We stole your thunder.
Probably.
Hey everybody, man, we are so excited to have you here tonight to be a part of the Biblicon event. We have 5 excellent speakers with us here tonight to talk about
3.
Daniel living in Babylon. And before we get into that, we're going to say
2.5.
if you would please bow for your ears. God, we're so thankful for tonight. We're thankful for this opportunity that we can get away from the busyness of school, the busyness of the world, and we can be here tonight to simply look at your word and reflect on it, to dive into it, and to meditate and study on it. Lord, we're thankful for these opportunities that it gives us opportunity to look to you in every way as we go along the path of life. Lord, we ask that you be with the speakers tonight, help them to communicate your word in an effective way, in a way in which we can learn from it and learn more about you and your will for us. God, we thank you so much for Jesus, and we thank you for his death on the cross. All these things we pray through Christ. Amen.
Man.
All right, in just a minute, we're going to get into the core of things, a couple of kind of pointers of what we're doing here. Our conversation will be a lot more like the 5 of us sitting at a coffee shop and talking about the text. We've got some questions we'll try to get to. If time allows, we'll take some questions from y'all and kind of investigate a little bit of that. And so just kind of picture you're kind of eavesdropping into the conversation at a coffee shop and you happen to have unlike what Carson just said, 4 quality speakers and 1 guy in a red shirt sitting there. So with that, we're going to kind of do a brief introduction because maybe you know some of us and maybe you don't. And we're going to go this way or that way. So, Jarrett, go.
Y'all know who I am, but for the live stream, I'm Jarrett Saltz. I've got 2 awesome daughters and an awesome, fantastic wife who are at home. You guys know me because my current occupation is I teach you animals. Sometimes I teach you. No. But I'm also a preacher down in Palmetto at Church of Christ with David McClister. And I've been at FCE for 5 years teaching. And I think I've had 3/4 of you guys. Just a few of y'all haven't had, but I look forward to seeing you guys in the future. And I'm clearly here late. You know, y'all don't like 9:15s. Neither do I. Just different sides of the spectrum. But looking forward to talking about Daniel.
So I'm Jesse's dad, otherwise known as Philip Martin. I serve as one of the shepherds for the Eastside Church of Christ in Sharpsburg, Georgia. I preach, I do stuff. I have a wonderful family. I'm taller than Jared. These are important things. Jared's going to be trying to be the comedy man tonight, I guess. But really it gets down to it. I really enjoy sharing the message of the Bible. And I hope that in our conversation tonight you can gain a little bit of appreciation for service in the kingdom. And as the theme for tonight is staying on the path, and so I'm going to do that myself and stay on path too. And I'm going to hand it over to Shane, and he's going to talk about stuff.
Well, in a way, I kind of wish I wasn't here tonight because I'm taking the place of Nathan Ward, who is sick. And I really wish that he was up to being here, but I'm glad to be here anyway. My name is Shane Scott, and I worship over with the Valrico congregation, where I am very blessed to know a lot of you in our fellowship together over there. I was a student here back in the late 80s and taught here in the late 90s and early 2000s, and always glad to be able to come here. This place means more to me every year, and I'm always glad to come and spend time with you guys.
I'm Jarrett Ferguson. I preach up in Bowling Green, Kentucky at the Lost River Church of Christ up there. I was here way back in 2020, so I recognize a lot of you and good friends with a lot of you.
A long time ago.
Yeah, way back when. So, but I'm always glad to come back here and see familiar faces, and I love to talk about the Bible. So looking forward to doing that tonight.
John Weaver. I'm the academic dean here. I have 5 kids, I think, and
Are you sure about this number?
Yeah, 5 kids,
Yeah.
and a
Do they all know?
Yorkie Terrier named Obi, and he's my best bud. I came to FC in '95. One of my jobs, I'm reminded of it right now at 9:30 at night, was to clean the administration building, and so I would go late at night and clean the administration building and early in the morning and work. And so lots of late night memories here. Let's see. My first job was as a newspaper carrier, actually. I worked as a newspaper carrier and learned a lot of lessons there about hard work. Most recently, I got this shirt from my daughter, who is my birthday today, as many of you now know. And it's the Pelicans t-shirt. You recognize that? Yeah, I've seen it. It's got the Pelicans on the back. You may not know, but there is a underground movement to make the Pelican the FC mascot again. And so I didn't know. No, okay. So there's some of it.
Yeah. And
It is true, so watch out.
It's very underground.
very underground.
Very underground. Grateful to be here tonight.
Yeah. So in a moment, John's going to introduce chapter 1, but before we do that, Shane is actually going to walk us into the culture, history, and context of Daniel's experience and give us a little insight into the big picture of the text. I will point on a side note that serving as a night watchman when I was a student here at Florida College, I never noted John engaging in any tomfoolery in my evening rounds when he was doing his work, so he was either very good or very sneaky. So we'll figure
What
that out
about
later.
cleaning? Did you see him doing much of that?
I have no comment. Shane, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Okay, go.
All right. Well, over at Valrico, we just finished a study of the book of Isaiah, the first half of which is overshadowed by a grave crisis instigated by the great superpower of the 700s BC, which is Assyria. A crisis so grave that it eventually takes out northern Israel. Samaria is conquered, the people of northern Israel are deported, and the Assyrian horde overflows down into Judah, conquering many cities in Judah, and eventually besieging Jerusalem, shutting up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage, as the Assyrian overlord bragged in some of his records. But the Lord intervenes and saves and spares Hezekiah in Jerusalem and Judah. But that very happy story has a bittersweet ending in Isaiah chapter 39, which is where my Bible is turned. One of the smaller nations, also subjugated unwillingly by the Assyrians, was a small country, a small power at the time called Babylon, which sends emissaries to King Hezekiah, who decides to show off everything he's got in the temple. And Isaiah the prophet comes and says, bad idea. And then he says to King Hezekiah in Isaiah chapter 39 and verse 6, behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and that which your fathers have stored up till this day shall be carried to Babylon. Nothing shall be left, says the Lord. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, will be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. So the temple is going to be plundered, and even some of the royal house will be taken to serve as eunuchs. So then flash forward into history about 100 years, and the superpower of Assyria is teetering on the brink of dissolution, as some of the smaller nations it had subjugated are trying to overthrow its yoke. This creates a situation in which the king of Egypt decides, I'd rather have Assyria in control than all of these other upstart nations. And so there's a great battle fought in the year 605 BC between Egypt and Assyria, and Babylon and other nations allied to it. You remember from Old Testament history and geography that King Josiah tried to intervene and intercept the Egyptians to keep them from going to fight in this battle, but was overwhelmed and was killed. The Babylonians were the winners of that battle. It's a battle called the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BC. It ends the Assyrian dominance, and it makes the Babylonians the new player on the world stage, led by their energetic king, Nebuchadnezzar. And just to make sure the nation of Judah decides to play nice, he takes a trip to Jerusalem, which is described for us in Daniel chapter 1. It says in verse 1, "In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. And then the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility." You will immediately recognize 2 elements from Isaiah 39 fulfilled in that statement. Some of the items from the temple carried to Babylon, and also some of the royal house taken and put under the supervision of the chief of the eunuchs, I think suggesting that that is going to be their fate as well, just like Isaiah told Hezekiah back in Isaiah chapter 39. That's where the book of Daniel fits in the story of Bible history. In the story of the message of the Bible, I'd like for you to closely consider the detail in verse 2, the way the Bible describes where the items from the temple and the nobility are taken. It's to the land of Shinar, a location that we know already from very early in the Bible story, from Genesis chapter 11, the location of the Tower of Babel. So it almost looks as if, after all of the plot of the Bible has unfolded, the first 11 chapters of Genesis, so filled with sin and the curse and the penalty, and then the promise to Abraham in Genesis 12, and then the succeeding plot lines of the unfolding of that story, it almost seems like there's been a reboot. And we've gone all of the way back before the wondrous promise to Abraham, back to the plains of Shinar itself, which could be very depressing, except this is not just simply the result of geopolitical maneuvering, which is so common even to this day in that part of the world. Did you notice what Daniel says in Daniel 1 and verse 2? The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand. This wasn't just simply because Judah lacked the military prowess of the Babylonians. This was ultimately an act of God, an act of judgment. The act that God had always warned the people, that in unfaithfulness to the covenant, they would find themselves in exile. And because God got them into this mess, God can bring them out. And Daniel looks forward to that. If you quickly go over to chapter 9, Daniel's pondering one of the prophets written during this period of the exile, the prophet Jeremiah. Most likely he was looking in what we call Jeremiah chapter 25. And as he does so, it says this in Daniel 9 and verse 1. In the first year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, by descent a Mede, who was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, perceived in the books the number of years that according to the word of the Lord to Jeremiah the prophet must pass before the end of the desolations of Jerusalem, namely 70 years. He knows from Jeremiah that there is a set time for this exile. And he knows, as he prays in verse 4, that God is a great and awesome God who keeps covenant. He knows that we've not rebooted back to the default before Abraham. He knows this is a part of God's judgment, but he also knows the promise to Abraham will ultimately be fulfilled. This book tells us how to deal with reality in the meantime.
All right, so before we get into chapter 1, there's one more thing we want to cover, and that's, Jarrett, could you walk us a little through the religious and really kind of the rebellious state of Babylon and why Babylon is used both in the Bible in the big picture, but also here in Daniel as a theological kind of pinpoint idea?
Yeah, and Shane got to this really well, I think, in some ways, so I can kind of abbreviate some of what I was going to say. And that is that Babylon is the beginning and end of the Bible. The fact that this is placed in the land of Shinar connects it intimately to what we see there in Genesis chapter 11, with the building of the Tower of Babel and the plain of Shinar. And we don't have time to go through the whole thing today, but you can follow this motif of rebellion and destruction throughout a lot of the Bible. You can look at it in Achan's sin, where he sees a belt from Shinar and takes it and covets it and rebels against God and is destroyed before it. But it's more than just that as well. That Babylon here, which is kind of this beginning and ending of the Bible, there at the farthest east as you can go, culminating this story of Genesis 1 through 11, where at every sin they're driven further east. They get driven from the garden and they're driven further east. Cain kills Abel and he's driven further east. They continue on, they build the Tower of Babel in the east. But they've gone as far as they can go. And the story of Abraham begins in Genesis chapter 12 with his family coming from the east and coming back to Canaan. Well, that's the exact same story that we see for Israel. That eventually, as Shane has done such a good job of showing, Israel, they've sinned so much, they are drugged so far east in Babylon. But God will not abandon them, just as he had called Abraham out of Babylon and Ur of the Chaldeans, he's going to call Israel as well. But this story isn't just the story of Israel, because you'll find Babylon at the very end of the Bible, in Revelation. Again, this enemy that has captivated and taken God's people. And again, one which is famous for its pride, its overweening desire to think, I built this, not God, just as we're going to see with Nebuchadnezzar a little bit later. And just like this image of exile is played out in the Tower of Babel, where God comes and all the people's fake unity is destroyed when God confuses their language, that at the end of the Bible, after Babel is destroyed, then we see that in heaven, people of every language and every nation and every people is unified in spite of their language by their proclamation that the Christ, the Lamb of God, is killed and lives again. And it then is this part of this story that spreads beyond the prophets that address the historical Neo-Babylonian Empire. It's beyond even the story that stretches from Genesis until Revelation, because this is then the story of God, theologically, about rebellion and God knowing his own and protecting them in the midst of exile. And that's why I think that this story that we're going to see in Daniel resonates so well. A few other things that are useful to think about Babylon is there's a lot of development that occurs for Israel's recognition and finally understanding things about God that occurs in Babylon. We see things like the closing or the parts of the books of the Psalter, the understanding that God is not just the God of Israel, but of the entire world, a recognition of all sorts of other really important theological, foundational truths that come out of what everybody living at that time would have seen as a sin, as a bad situation of being in exile. And yet God can take this exile and turn it into something good, using it as a refining process for his people, and he will not abandon them there.
Yeah, so we're kind of like seeing like from Adam to Adam, garden to garden, Babylon to Babylon, and figuring out what man needs to do to make the proper transition. Do they seek the garden or do they seek Babylon? And so, John, walk us into chapter 1, and what do we see there?
All right, turn with me to chapter 1 if you have it. Daniel chapter 1. We're going to do a combination of summary overview and then read. We're going to come down to ending the reading and the summary, and the question I think we're beginning with here is the following. How did Daniel manage to remain faithful to God despite his challenges? So this is a question of a purposeful path. We've been asked to talk about this, and it's a question of what do we learn from these stories about faithfulness and how Daniel did that. That's the question I think we're going to focus in on here initially. And so let me do a summary here of the first few verses, and then we're going to read beginning in verse 8. So we've seen that the king of Babylon picks these best young men to serve in his palace staff. You see that in verses 3 through 4. And so then in verses 4 through 5, you see he instructs Ashpenaz, which is the chief of his royal court, to train the young men, to give them a daily portion of fine food and wine from the king's table, a key image there of the king's table. And so there are 4 members of this group that are singled out by name here: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They're in verse 6. And you'll notice that they're all given new Babylonian names. Right? We're familiar with these. Daniel, whose name means what? My judge is God. He's renamed Belteshazzar. Hananiah, whose name means the Lord has been gracious, becomes Shadrach. Mishael, which means who is what God is, receives the name Meshach. And Azariah, which means the Lord has helped, was renamed Abednego. That's in verse 7. And so with the exception of Abednego, which means the servant of Nego, we don't really know what these Babylonian names mean. However, the renaming of these young men with the Babylonian names indicates they're viewed now as Babylonian subjects. Their identity has been changed fundamentally by where they are at some level. And so we pick up in verse 8. Let's read here verse 8 down through 16. Verse 8 is going to be a key verse as we start off here. But Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. Therefore he asked the chief of the eunuchs to allow him not to defile himself. And God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and your drink. For why should he see that you are in worse condition than the youths who are of your own age? So you would endanger my head with the king. Then Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had assigned over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance and the appearance of the youths who eat the king's food be observed by you, and deal with your servants according to what you see. So he listened to them in this matter and tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, it was seen that they were better in appearance and fatter in flesh than all the youths who ate the king's food. So the steward took away their food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And so then what you see in the rest of the chapter in verses 17 down through 21 is that the Lord rewards these youths by giving them special wisdom. And he enables Daniel to be able to interpret dreams and visions there in verse 17. And then when their training is over, the king interviews them. You see that in verses 18 and 19 and finds that they're superior than everyone else. And so they're assigned to the royal court, and they quickly surpass everyone else in wisdom. And so Daniel becomes a fixture in the palace we see here at the end of the chapter in verse 21, and he serves the king for more than 60 years. And so there's a longevity to this. So the question here in Daniel chapter 1, I think we're going to begin with, is the question of Daniel's path in life. We're wanting to start off with that. And the question is how did Daniel manage to remain faithful to God despite the challenges that he faced? And so I'd like to open that up to the group here to think about. It occurs to me that maybe one place to start here would be in verse 8. So there's some key verbs there maybe that we could talk about and what causes Daniel to be able to remain faithful to God. Key idea maybe there being one of resolution, right?
Yeah,
what do y'all think?
Yeah, I was thinking about it, and Daniel serves as kind of a narrative contrast to Joseph in some ways and helps us clarify a couple of things really quickly. The attempt of the way the text is laid out is that his spiritual identity is being stripped from him with this renaming. For Israel, family meant faithfulness. Family meant a future perspective of redemption and rescue in heaven, really is how they saw that. And with that stripping of that identity, they're expecting him to become like Babylon. Wherein Joseph, who is given the same basic opportunity, he gradually assimilates into Egypt. And he walks like an Egyptian at the end. Like he's dressing like one, acting like one, worshiping like one, enslaving like one. He's basically Egyptian until Judah rescues him. And so in that contrast of resolution, wherever Joseph was in God's usefulness to him, that resolute nature wasn't there. And the other aspect that's really interesting is his capacity to interpret dreams. It turns Joseph into the wish level purchase of an interpreter, because in the end, we're not quite sure whether or not he is actually interpreting dreams or he is just being who he is and trying to demonstrate his presence. And so I think really for us, we got to pay attention to our identity in a world that swirls around us and says, no, you don't need to be that. You should be different this way. You need to be like us politically, ideologically, dress, speech, and reassert our nature as transformed believers and say, this is what Christ looks like in a culture that didn't like him either. And I think that's at least a good start mentally for me to start chewing on.
One thing that we might also notice is in contrast to the king's food, which Daniel seems to keep at arm's length. That doesn't seem to be the case with the education he got. It says back over in verse 4, at the end of verse 4, that they were taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. It says in verse 17, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom. And then it says in verse 20 that they exceeded in every manner of wisdom and understanding all the other wise men. So I don't want to make too much of this. I was talking to some of our young disciples last week at Varico that I don't think this is a how to go to college chapter in the Bible, but I do think there is one lesson that we can take from this, that even though Daniel and his friends are far away from home, far away from the normal spiritual climate they lived in, that didn't mean that every aspect of life in Babylon was automatically a source of defilement and had to be rejected. Some things Daniel thought, but not everything, including aspects of their education. And as the book unfolds, they use this learning, both the learning God blessed them with and also the learning they received, for God's glory, to be able to serve him and to serve his purposes. So I think one application to take away is all of us see ourselves as exiles and strangers, and particularly for all of you who are in school, is to realize you can take education, even when it comes from pagans, for lack of a better term, but you can still filter it and use it for the glory of God, so long as that is its ultimate objective. There's a famous illustration that the early church writer Augustine uses when he says, just like the Israelites left Egypt, and when they left Egypt, they plundered the Egyptians of their gold and silver and jewels so that they could use those for the glory of God. You can take the plunder, the jewels, the tidbits of a pagan education and use it for the glory of God as well. Just so long as you don't do what Israel ended up doing, which is turning it into an idol. But as long as you use it as a means to an end, which is to glorify God, and realize that ultimately all truth comes from God, since he is the founder and sustainer of all reality, then one way to maintain your faith is use what you can use. Just use it for the glory of God.
So I think you're right. I think this idea is their minds are able to range widely here in the literature you see there in verse 17. But at the same time, there are real restrictions that are being imposed upon their bodies, right? So it's somewhat paradoxical. And so, the question that I have is what is so wrong with the king's food? What's going on here, right? So it's an issue of food and wine. I wonder how y'all think about that, because you could argue, well, maybe there's some sort of kosher issue here, but that seems kind of problematic when you start to look at it. The more you investigate this, you realize, well, it's probably not a kosher issue. It's probably not the fact that it was offered to idols, because vegetables and flour and such were offered to idols. And so, what do y'all think? What is it about this food that makes it foreboding for Daniel? What's your thinking on that?
I guess it's going to me. I think part of it has to do with a phrase that you might hear is you eat the king's food, you become the king's man. So maybe that has something to do with it. I don't know if salts particularly might have a better explanation of that. But.
No, certainly not. So that's Jared, go ahead.
No, I like it. You said a lot.
Fair.
You even included a nice German word for us. So for those of y'all, verboten means forbidden.
Yeah.
You're like, oh yes, of course. You can use that at home. See, you gained something from your education. You plundered Egypt.
That's right.
But
Don't walk like one, though.
yeah, but I think John's exactly right. This isn't a kosher issue. And meat sacrificed to idols isn't an issue that we read about in the Old Testament. That this is a decision that they have made fundamentally to say we're not going to fully avail ourselves of this cultural change that is representative of a total change. Because these changes of names and clothing and education, they're, as Shane had mentioned and John's mentioned and Philip's mentioned, it's trying to become Babylonians. And there's only so much they can push back on. That this is where they live now. Jeremiah chapter 27 says, look, seek the peace of the city. And they're going to do that. These are people who are going to serve this king who is held up as the height of pride well. But they had to pick something that says, this is going to be a line in the sand. And we can't sacrifice everything that we are. We cannot become Babylonians in spite of all of the pressures to do so. And they pick what seems to be the path of least resistance that becomes the foundation of their later shifts. I don't want to jump into chapters 2 and 3 too quickly, but there's going to be some big issues that they're going to run into. But they've already decided right now that they cannot be conformed to the world, that they are transformed by who their God is and what he has done for them. And this is one thing. It didn't have to be this, I don't think, necessarily, but it had to be something to show that they were still themselves. And I think that that's something that's really important for ourselves, too. Is, so often we misinterpret the peculiar people line and think we're supposed to be odd. Maybe so. In some ways, certainly so. But we are supposed to be different than the world around us. And there are going to be things that, while not inherently sinful, they're not breaking the law. We just need to say, because I need to make sure for myself that I remember who I am, I'm not going to do this thing.
Yeah, and it can symbolize, this food can symbolize a refusal to assimilate, right? And so there's this, it's a real pollution, but it's a symbolic avoidance of a symbol of assimilation within the Babylonian culture, don't you think?
It's almost like a mirror image of, how, like, for example, in the Gospel of Luke especially, there's great emphasis laid on table fellowship. Jesus eats with people to signify his unity with them. Maybe this is sort of the inverse of that. Maybe they just felt like they've given us names, they're giving us education. We've got to find some place to draw a line to maintain, our own identity and our own table fellowship. Maybe this was it. I will say I feel a certain kinship with Daniel and his friends. They ate vegetables and water for several days and gained weight. I tried a cabbage soup diet and I gained weight. So,
no comment. I found this interesting, too. There's another contrast point. We've got two kings at the beginning of the historical narratives. You got Saul, who looks and acts like a king should be, but his knowledge of both legal Israel and cultural Israel is just like super paper thin. He doesn't act like one of them. He doesn't look like one of them, and yet he's their king. And so his character matches that. And then you get David, who comes in with all of his problematic behavior on the table as well, but he seems more aware of cultural and legal Israel. And so Daniel here and his compatriots seem to be more of that David context where they are aware, not only, I think, of the law and its culture and whom they are in this sense, but also, I would include, they're actually aware of their history. And they know what can happen in the sense of being assimilated. It's not really expressed out to us in the clear terminology, but their behavior indicates they know it's a risk. And so on a practical level, I would just kind of key into there. Look, as you step forward into the world that's ahead of you, you need to be a little bit intentional with that and say, I got to know who I am. And that, by the way, is more than having the right answers to the right questions. It's a complete commitment to the identity you accept when you're melded in or grafted into the kingdom of God. And when you accept that, it may mean you make commitments that seem odd. Like, I'm never going to do this, because it's a reflection of that commitment. And so if we narrow it down, again, now moving off of the text of Daniel and into the text of our lives, it may come across as, all right, so I don't personally believe, by the way, that it's mandatory to be at every single time the doors are open at the assembly of the church I'm part of. But maybe I say instead, I don't care about that. My commitment is that if it's all possible for me, I'll be there. That's a shift between saying God told me to do it and I'm committing to do it. And I think that's the tone of this text right here. Because I might say on top of that, it's really good for me to be there. It's good for me, but it also may serve others by my presence. And so you can kind of make some extension points and say, okay, do this, do this, do this, as reflections of my personal identity within the space of Christ.
Just to jump off that real quick, I think it's maybe the KJV that says he purposed in his heart. I like that phrase a lot. But what impresses me about their faith here is, on one hand, it's resilient, right? And we talked about that a fair amount. There's this resiliency about their faith. But then what also impresses me about it is it's also reasonable. Like they realize that, okay, this is the line that we're drawing in the sand, and this is this is the point at which, for whatever reason, we think if we cave in this moment, this will be the point of no return. We will have fully assimilated. And so this is the line that they draw, and as they explain this, they don't protest, they don't go out and riot or fold their arms in complain or anything like that. Daniel comes and he approaches, essentially, I guess you could call him sort of the schoolmaster of the University of Babylon, and he approaches him and he approaches him in a very humble way, and just not only does he ask for them to not partake of the food and the wine of the king, but he offers an alternative. And so you see this sort of reasonableness about their faith, that, hey, I'm not just going to fold my arms and protest, but I'm going to offer some kind of alternative. Hey, let's try this. And so the schoolmaster comes back and he says, well, look, if this happens, then I've got the king breathing down my neck, and if he sees that y'all aren't fuller or as full and fat as the other ones, he's going to be after me. I could lose my life for this. And so again, Daniel comes back with this very reasonable kind of faith, and he says, okay, well, let's just test this. Let's just see what it's like for 10 days. Let's just test this and see. And so you can see how he kind of works through that in his mind. And I think that's a good principle for us as we carry our faith into the world, that it is resilient, right? That we draw that line in the sand, and it might be something that is seemingly arbitrary, but that as we do that, it's also reasonable. We have a reason behind it, and we can work with people about how we approach that. And as that happens, they end up, of course, finding themselves standing before the king 10 times fuller, and that's something that's interesting to me. I don't know what y'all's perspective is on that, but as far as just like an application for us, what really jumps out about that to me is the world should be able to test us in some way, right? The world should be able to look at our faith and our life and path, and as we follow Christ, and notice that there is something different about us. And I think the question that is good for us to be thinking about is, do I really believe that the way and the path of God is, in the end, going to prove 10 times better and fuller than the ways of the world? When I choose this path, even if it's some arbitrary kind of line in the sand, when I choose this path, do I really believe that at the end of it, I'll have that fuller faith? And will the world be able to tell that? Will I be able to stand before the world as I stay along this path, and they be able to see that I have a fuller joy, a fuller sense of peace and security, that in all these different ways my life is proven 10 times fuller? And as they recognize that, maybe that's the starting point, even in Nebuchadnezzar's mind, that there's something different about these young men from Babylon. And maybe that's the starting point of his conversion. But I think it's just interesting to think about that resiliency and reasonability about their faith, and how in the end that proves them to be 10 times fuller, and maybe the start of what Nebuchadnezzar began to see.
So we're talking about practical. We wanted to get to the practical, and we'll probably need to transition here in a little pretty soon.
Yeah,
okay.
quick.
Let's just say this: how many of you have ever been on a diet? Anybody ever been on a diet? Probably don't want to raise your hand, but you can admit it. How many of you have kept to your diet in every case? I don't see any hands. Okay.
For how long?
Fair enough. This is about a diet, right? And they keep to their diet. And I have a real problem with this chapter, actually. I really do. It's idealistic, unrealistically so.
Well, Jarrett just made the point
Yeah.
that their faith was resilient and reasonable. And then if you call it remarkable, now that's Bible preaching right there. 3 R's.
That's a good sermon.
That's a good sermon
Yeah.
right there.
Is that
Yeah.
where we say stand and sing right
That's
after that?
stand and sing, baby,
Okay,
right
just making
there.
sure. Yeah.
But they are ideals. I mean, they're models, obviously, for faith in the exile. But I think you realize is that they're kind of two-dimensional characters to me. Unlike a David or a Joseph who make mistakes and are problematic in many ways, Daniel doesn't mess up. He's an ideal here. And I think we recognize that you have these characters within they're historical characters, but they're written about in a way that is meant to model a certain behavior. And he resolves himself. He he sets his priorities straight, and we see that he's able to live that life. And it's one way of encouraging us, giving us hope that we can do the same. I think, though, to realize, though, that this has a place within Scripture as an ideal type, which is balanced by the realization that no one is perfect, that we all fall short. And so to recognize this as part of a broader context of describing God's people, where not everybody can keep their diet. And in fact, no one can. And so this is we need to understand this within a broader context, a broader canon of Scripture, to say this gives us hope for faithfulness, to recognize, though, too, that in the end, we all sin and fall short. So I think it's important to have that gut check as we talk about these sorts of passages.
Yeah. So we're about to transition into chapters 2 through 6 in a second. I will add one little comment to Jarrett's thing. It's a little tiny intertextual tidbit. When he's talking about those 10 time thing, I immediately think about how God used the 10 talent context. It's not that those people were exceptionally talented beyond, it's that he provided them opportunity. And you look at what these guys are going to do, they're going to be used in a 10 talent way. They're going to be expected to have deep return, and they do. Their faith is an illustration of that. And so it's just an interesting way to kind of think about that big idea. If there's nothing else from each of you guys, we're good to go into chapter 2, or do you got
I was going to say that this is actually a pretty rare word in Hebrew. It's used very rarely, but of the fat cows that are swallowed up by the skinny cows.
That's
so
right.
A lot of particular intertextual links between Joseph and Daniel. So take that one for what you paid for it.
Yeah. Free. All right, so we're going to just do quick summaries of each of the chapters in order to keep on task and stay on the path in that way, in a more literal sense. And we're going to work across the table. So just briefly remind ourselves about what's in each of these chapters. Jared, that means brief. Brief.
He told me I had 38 seconds to explain chapter 2. I've got my timer up, so I'm ready to go.
All right.
In Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 2 of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. Like all kings, they have a dream, and you realize that, hey, this is another Joseph episode. He comes in, he says, guys, I've got a dream. The readers are like, sure. The wise men, the sages, the priests, they tell us what you dreamed, and we'll tell you what it means. And he says, no. I've done this before. You guys tell me what I dreamed, and then I'll know you know your stuff, and you can tell me what it means. They say, that's ridiculous. And the king's like, you're right. I'm going to kill you all. Daniel finds out and says, wait, what? Let me tell you what the dream actually means. And that's what he's going to do. He's going to tell them exactly what it means. He tells them what the dream is, first of all. He says, well, listen, Neb, you had a dream of a buff statue. He had a head of gold, right? He had a chest and arms of silver. It just kind of keeps on going like that. And the king's like, that is exactly what I dreamed. Fantastic. There's a problem with the dream, of course. It starts out golden. He says, listen, you are the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar feels pretty good about that, except it continues on. That each of these successive parts of this statue are successive kingdoms. And although our vision ends with the kind of dual interpretation of whether it's the Seleucid and Ptolemaic kingdoms, the Greek powers for these legs mixed with clay and iron, or in its greater fulfillment that it is Rome, the big and most important part of this dream is that in the middle of this thing, a stone comes out of a mountain, not made with hands, and it crushes, absolutely destroys the statue of all the kingdoms of the earth. And that statue, of course, is the kingdom of God. And that is the thing that we recognize that this is going to be. That kingdoms are going to come, and they're going to rise and fall, and each one is going to be like the one before. But God's kingdom is going to come, and it will crush all of the kingdoms of this earth. And it will last forever.
All right, you did get 38 seconds. So we'll praise him for that for once, but that's it.
It was exactly 38 before I started the dream, by the way. Just making sure that we
Exactly
can
38
make fun of Philip.
Well, that's normal. So chapter 3 is really simple. It's a reminder. Raise your hand if you've been to VBS in life. How many of you guys went to VBS? You guys know chapter 3, right? Okay, I could say done, but I won't. But really, there's two things. You've got the setup, which is the golden image, and then you have the resolution of the story in the fiery furnace, or the pit of doom, or the ego displayed. There's a couple of things that take place I think are really important for us. This is a great counterplay. John used idealized when we're talking about Daniel, wherein we look at Moses, we look at the Exodus, and you see a king hardened and then a king turned. And so there's great power in each of those things that are kind of laid out for us here in chapter 3. And I think then it's really super important for us to think about how's God going to use these images. Because if this is Babylon, and it is, in the sense of its metaphor, it reappears a lot in the text of Revelation where the kingdom picture is opening up. And so in that, we get to really see these pictures here that are more than just a superimposed literal event. This actually helps us understand on the split of the world something that takes place. And this is where this kind of occurs. In this section, we get to see God interact with mankind. It's really rare in the Old Testament historical narrative sections where God's hand reaches into the lives of men in this way. Normally, the seen realm and the unseen realm are like nowhere near each other. But here they are. And again, going back to Exodus, what's different here is only one of them is enabled in the spiritual sense. Nebuchadnezzar's people don't have power, and yet God's people have all the power. And so, again, idealized maybe, but also maybe more realized. But that tells us a little bit about what we're trying to see because it comes off of the edge of this kingdom picture in chapter 2.
And then we come to Daniel chapter 4, which begins and ends the same way. It begins and ends with a statement of praise to God, a doxology, which helps to frame what this chapter is about and what the book is about. It's to reassure Israel that what has happened with the exile is not just events spinning out of control. This is the plan of God, and God rules in the kingdoms of men, including in the punishment that's happened to Israel, but also in their deliverance. The dream is a dream of Nebuchadnezzar, like in chapter 2, although this time it's more of a nightmare. He's alarmed by it. He says at the end of verse 5. He tells Daniel the dream in verses 10 and following. I saw a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to heaven, and it was visible to the end of the whole earth, and its leaves feed everyone and everything. Sounds great. Then in verse 13, he says, I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts from under it and birds from its branches, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with dew of heaven. So now we learn that this tree represents a person that's been cut down to size, so to speak. Let his portion be with the beasts and the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed for a man's. Let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over. Which is bad and good at the same time because it's only 7. It means there is a limit to this. In verse 19, Daniel is afraid to tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream means because it's pretty obvious it's bad news. Not only that, you'll notice that verse 19 reminds us that Daniel's name is Belteshazzar, that he belongs to Nebuchadnezzar. It takes great courage to tell the king this bad news, to speak truth to power, as we say. And I think it's interesting that even though Daniel is a hostage, he's a captive, he's a long way from home, it's clear he wishes this, in a way, wasn't going to happen. He has respect for Nebuchadnezzar, which is a good reminder for us in this passage and others, like in Jeremiah 29, where when you're exiles in the foreign country, you shouldn't hope that just everything collapses. You want good to happen. You want to be a blessing, just like Abraham's people are supposed to be. In any event, Daniel tells him that this dream means bad news for him, which we see fulfilled in verse 29. At the end of 12 months, he was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, Is not this great Babylon, which I've built by my mighty power, as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? Very similar to Herod Agrippa's speech in Acts chapter 12, assuming great honor for himself. And reminds us once again of what happened in Babylon in Genesis 11, when they build a great tower to the heavens so that they can make their name great. Only God makes a name great, like he promises Abraham in Genesis 12. And just to remind Nebuchadnezzar of this man who thinks he's a god is reduced to being an animal, to be reminded that he's just a man. And so in verse 33, immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men and ate grass like an ox, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. But as God promised, this is only limited, and the chapter ends with Nebuchadnezzar giving a statement of praise to the one true God, just like this chapter began, to remind us that even the greatest kings, the head of gold, Nebuchadnezzar, is ultimately a tool in the hand of the true and high king who's working out his purposes for Babylon, but more importantly, from our vantage point, for his people.
So as chapter 4 ends on a very high note, and it seems like everything is going well, chapter 5 really starts to take a turn. So the scene has changed quite a bit by chapter 5, and by this point, the Medo-Persian army has advanced throughout the territory of Babylon, and everybody in the kingdom knows it. And for whatever reason, whether it's because they're, let us eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die, whether they're just trying to block out the inevitable fate of what's about to happen, or they're calling on the gods of Babylon, they have this huge feast. And they bring out, it says in verse 2, the vessels of gold and silver that Nebuchadnezzar, or Neb, his father, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem to be brought out. And so they bring out the same vessels that Nebuchadnezzar had taken. And they have this feast. And as they're doing that, all of a sudden, this hand appears and is writing on the wall. And of course, that's not supposed to happen. So they're like, well, we should probably find what this means, what this writing says, because no one is able to interpret it. And finally, the queen comes and she says, hey, I know a guy. Nebi had a guy who knew his stuff. So he had the spirit of the holy gods, she says in verse 11. And so they find Daniel. He's brought before the king, now much older. And the king says, you are one of the exiles of Judah. You knew my father, and I've heard of your excellent wisdom. And so he kind of offers Daniel, he says, look, I'll give you all of these things. You'll be third ruler in the kingdom. And Daniel says, hey, I don't want any of that because I know what's about to happen. And so he gives the interpretation, but before he does that, he says, let me tell you a story. And usually that doesn't go well when someone pulls you aside and says, hey, let me tell you something. This is Daniel's rebuke. He says, I knew your father. I was close with him. And this was his story. And he goes through that same sort of conversion story that happened in chapter 4 and how he was humbled. And he says, look, Belshazzar, you knew all of this. You knew exactly what had happened, and yet, if you look at verse 22, Belshazzar, you, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this, but you lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. And he goes on to describe the rest of what was going on in this feast, and he says, but as you've done all this, the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. And then he gives that interpretation that the kingdom has been divided. It's going to be conquered this very night. And I guess what we see from that is this contrast between two characters, between two men, Belshazzar and Belteshazzar. And one is the person who, through pride, exalts himself and makes a name for himself, and Belteshazzar, who continually gives the credit to God and proves, just as Habakkuk would say, that the righteous will live and thrive by faithfulness to God.
And then chapter 6, let me just very brief. This is the story of Daniel in the lion's den. I think we know this well. I think the thing that I would emphasize here is this is a story about intrigue in a court. These are sometimes called court stories or court narratives. And what's interesting is you have half the court that's against Daniel, and half, or the king, in this case Darius, who's the third king we're introduced to in Daniel, who's for him. There's kind of I feel like a little bit of a man crush there. Kind of, he really likes Daniel. Really is affectionate towards him. And so there's a loyalty there. You like that? I mean, it's real. They're close, and I think that's kind of the point. Is that the God's person can be respected, and even the king can have an affection for him. And in the end, the king comes to understand that who Daniel's God is. So you know the story. There's this petition there's a court intrigue. The presidents and the other rulers are wanting to find a ground for complaint against Daniel. They have this petition made that you can't say a petition to any other god besides the king for a period of time. Daniel knows this. He prays towards Jerusalem. We see his piety here in this chapter. Maybe we can come back to that. And the king is really fooled, actually. He's tricked into this step of being thrown into the lion's den. And so Daniel's in there, and the king is distressed by this, and he's very pleased when he finds out in verses 19 and 20 that Daniel is not killed in the lion's den, and he punishes those whom had betrayed him, who had deceived him there in chapter 6, verses 24 and following. And then we come down to the end, and this concludes this first half of Daniel, which is a good summary, I think, of a lot of the themes that you see throughout these chapters. Let's just read Daniel chapter 6, verses 25 down through 28. Daniel 6, 25 through 28. Then King Darius wrote to all the peoples, nations, and languages that dwell on the earth. Peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in all my royal dominion people are to tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God, enduring forever. His kingdom shall never be destroyed, and his dominion shall be to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. He who has saved Daniel from the power of the lions. So this Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius and the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And so you see this basic lesson of that Daniel's salvation is evidence of God's power to deliver, and God's kingdom is one that's eternal and universal. And that's a kind of a basic message here of the sovereignty of God there. Okay, go ahead.
Brother Weaver, I just wanted to ask in verse 24,
wait a minute now.
when the men who accused Daniel are thrown into the lion's den and the lions overpowered them and broke out their bones, would you also consider that a man crush?
Yeah, it was clearly a man crush.
So it's a different kind of man crush.
I just wanted to point something out. I need to point something out, like super important. So I fully expected Jared to say man crush. I did not expect John Weaver to say man crush.
When I led with Neb, it was all over at that point.
You're leading with Neb because you're lazy. That way you don't have to say the rest
How
of the
many
word.
times do you have to type Nebuchadrezzar before you're just like, no, it's Neb. It's Neb.
That's all you're doing there. So I think it's important now to kind of move into, again, our kind of practical exploration of the text and pay attention to a couple of things. A few things to note here, and John highlighted this 50-50 split context this is shown to us. God chooses the narrative to teach us a truth while also teaching us history, while also showing us his nature. And so in this spot, we can kind of make a quick couple points, because we remind ourselves that Babylon is both a real place, but it's the picture of all places. One of the questions that was generated for us was, are we living in Babylon today? And I'll give you my quick short answer when I have a longer, more expansive answer. But the answer is always yes. We are sojourners. This is not our kingdom. And yet we often find ourselves latched in or drawn into a kingdom conflict that's not the right kingdom conflict. And historically, it's almost always 50-50. It doesn't seem that way, and it always seems like our guy is not that guy. But he always builds a tower to himself, and he always makes a temple to himself, and he always puts himself on every single label. That's like a history lesson 101. That's just how it goes. And then believers are like, what do we do? How do we handle this? And so you can kind of see that bearing itself out, and then the believer gets tossed in the grinder of the middle. You probably heard the phrase, when life gives you lemons, make lemonade. Well, a more realistic one, at least in this context here, is if life gives you lemon, get ready to get squeezed. Like, that's just how it actually works in a more literal sense. And that's what goes on here for Daniel. He's getting squeezed, even though he hasn't done anything justifiable to be in the vice.
Now we're back to that man crush again, Phil. Thank you so much for that.
I think just another practical lesson from this book, you know, we always want to be careful in over moralizing stories like what we see in Daniel as if they are just designed to give us, you know, vacation Bible school lessons. There's obviously bigger things at work here in this book, as we've seen, the sovereignty of God in the midst of turbulent circumstances. But it does seem to me that one legitimate practical application you can make for all of us, it's emphasized in the book, both with Daniel and his friends, that they were excellent representatives in every way that they could be without compromising their faith. And in fact, you know, what a great testimony to Daniel in Daniel 6. The only complaint that could be lodged against him by his envious, you know, competitors is his faith in God. So I think on a practical level, as we do live in Babylon, I do think there are some people in our culture which is still haunted by Jesus enough, there's still enough residual respect for Jesus, that there are people in the world who genuinely admire and appreciate people who try to live the Christian faith. I also think there are people, and maybe this is becoming more common, who are inordinately hostile and suspicious of and critical of people who are people of faith, which will mean that you're going to be held to a double standard in some instances, in your academic work and just in real work. And in a way that's not fair, but in a way, what better motivator to just make a decision to be as excellent a representative of the people of Jesus Christ as you can be. And Peter, in 1 Peter chapter 2, which I think is so similar in some of its instruction, says in verse 11, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul." Very much what Daniel and his friends did with the food issues. "Keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good works and glorify God on the day of visitation." So I think that what Peter is calling all of us to do is to be excellent representatives of our great King. And it will be the case that no matter how genuine and sincere you try to be that, there will be people who speak against you. That's just the way that it is. Nobody said carrying a cross was going to be fair, but to the extent that you can be a model of what the people of the Lord should be, Peter points to a time when someday they will see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. Sometimes the day of visitation is a good visit from God. Sorry. My phone thinks that I'm talking to it. Anytime I say a word that has S-I-R in it, my phone thinks I'm talking to it. I just hope that my phone does not address me by the name that I have taught my phone to address me with.
I actually do.
Hey Siri, what did I tell you to call me?
You're Shane, but since we're friends, I get to call you Galactic Overlord.
So that's my name, according to my phone. Well, as we live under King Jesus, I think the lesson here is be an excellent example and have good deeds in your life. And maybe it'll lead people to glorify God in the day of God's visitation of salvation. Or maybe it will lead them to glorify God in the visitation of judgment. But either way, the glory of God is what's at stake.
So we've got a few other things I want to make sure that we cover that are part of the program, from the standpoint of getting to the heart of the matter in some of this. And with that, on the practical level again, one of the questions that's asked is how can we apply faithfulness like Daniel demonstrates to practical everyday life after we've left, say, Florida College or the educational environment? Like, what's going on, looking about this, because that's kind of what Daniel does in some ways. He goes from the University of Nebi to living and serving for 70 years in a place where leadership changes around him, where sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. So what are some practical lessons do you guys see and moving to a larger picture.
I think one thing that's useful to think about in this is that asking preachers that question is the worst idea in the world. And let me explain that for a second. Because for a lot of us, we went from an educational setting to having a job where most of the time we're surrounded by Christians. Now, anybody who's also been a preacher or probably even a Christian realizes that doesn't mean they always act like Christians should. We are people too, including preachers. But what we have here is this idea, again, and Shane's already addressed a lot of it, and Jarrett and John, and I guess Philip too. But what we have is this seeking the peace of the city, as Jeremiah would say in Jeremiah 29, verse 7, of being excellent, of pursuing whatever we can, of doing your work for God, but recognize that even in spite of this kind of Christ-haunted, Flannery O'Connor sort of an idea of maybe people will appreciate what we've done, that ultimately what we're called to is to suffer. Like, that's what Jesus says. If you want to follow me every day, pick up your cross and follow me. Now, that doesn't mean that, like, if we're not being persecuted, then we're doing something wrong. That's not what I'm emphasizing. But what we have is a commitment, ultimately, to being crucified, even if it's just us, as Paul would say, crucifying ourselves. And that, I think, is the thing that we all need to hold in front of ourselves, is that we are supposed to be crucifying ourselves, that we are supposed to being replacing day by day our flesh with the Spirit. And that is something that you don't just start after you leave FC. You start here. You start wherever you're at. You start now. And that is a position and an action and a goal and a desire that never has a beginning other than now. It never has an ending until Christ comes again. And that's something that I think that we all need to make sure that we, whether we purpose in our heart or resolve, whatever your version says, is that whatever we have to do, we do that first. Because that ultimately, that's the only thing that's going to matter.
You know, one thing I would encourage all of you, and I need reminders of this a lot. As John was teaching, he ended in Daniel 6 with Daniel now in Persia. So if the captivity lasted 70 years and Daniel's there from start to finish, he was quite an elderly man. And think about the changes he saw in his lifetime. As a child in the royal house in Jerusalem, leaving there eventually from a nation that in all intents and purposes ceased to exist, then to Babylon, and then that nation ceases to exist, and then Persia takes over. And I think about my senior year in Florida College. Right after I graduated, the Soviet Union disintegrated. All of my childhood was dominated by, the threats of nuclear catastrophe and war with the Soviet Union. And then the year I graduated, that threat's gone. It's a whole different world. And then the world of concern about Islamic terrorism began. And now there's concerns about Russia, and then especially about China. And my point is, it's easy in any given moment in the slice of the news to be worried, pessimistic, fearful, want to just go and run away and hide. The reality is, we just have no idea. All we really know is what Daniel knew, which is God's in control. And in the meantime, I need to be faithful wherever I am, be an excellent example wherever I am. And I tend to be pretty pessimistic about the short-term future of our country, maybe in the long term. I don't really know. And I just need to be reminded, hey, things can change wildly and quickly. The key thing is to keep your focus on the Lord, to keep your focus on being faithful to Him, whatever the circumstances are like. Who knows what things are going to be like?
Yeah, I might also include this concept that will move us down the conversational path a little bit. Like Shane, I remember finishing high school, and at the close of high school, the thought from the class of 91 was we were all going to get drafted. We just assumed that the Gulf War conflict was going to spill out into everywhere, and all of us young, able-bodied men are going to be serving, and that's just going to happen. Of course, we were dumb because we didn't understand that the future we think that's going to happen probably isn't, because we just don't know. And our ignorance drives our behavior. And so thinking forward about this, here's a way to think about this. When you complete a degree, whatever it is, what you've actually gained is an invitation to a new opportunity. You have a ticket to an interview, a ticket to a conversation, and you get to participate in what that looks like, whatever role you choose to serve in. When I started preaching, Some of the things that I do in that role are not what I planned at all. Like some conversations, not what I thought I was going to do, especially, and I'll speak really narrowly to that area of expertise. Any of you young men who want to preach, what you will actually be doing and what you think you'll be doing are not the same thing. But in conversation with my friends who also do all kinds of things, engineers, lawyers, police officers, builders, folks who work in all kinds of financial business areas, what they thought they were going to do and what they actually do are also not the same thing. So learning to be flexible, and yet, as our three-point outline also calls on us to be, is that we have to keep that sense of resolute nature of who we are, because God actually can turn us into, wait for it, remarkable people. He actually can. And we're remarkable not because we ourselves are remarkable, it's because our faith actually is that lampstand. We are the ones who demonstrate who Jesus is to people who don't read their Bibles. That's really the practical level of that for me, at least. We kind of already answered this, at least from my level, are we living in Babylon today? But I wanted to revisit that a little bit if anyone wanted to take a little time to talk about that in more detailed fashion. Also, we've got some other questions we can get to as well in our list of stuff that was presented to us. But how would you answer that question? Because America is the greatest nation of all time, right? Absolutely, just the best. But how many of you have spent more than 2 weeks outside of the United States? Do we have things in America that aren't that great? And other nations might do those things better? Greatness is measured by all kinds of standards. America's awesome. Like, we literally have the best tacos. We do. I've traveled enough, I feel like I can definitively speak on that subject. Jared, am I wrong?
I mean, Torchy's is the best tacos. I don't know about America writ
We
large.
have them.
I've
They're
eaten at
ours.
Taco Bell.
We also have the worst tacos. So, I mean, but we can kind of think about that thematically. We think about our country, and we're like, are we Babylon? We are, but we still have to serve Babylon. We serve our nations, wherever we might be. We serve in ways that bring glory and honor to God. And I think a connection we can make is now thinking about this. How do the large themes, the theological themes of the nature of God, his power interacting with man, interact with our reading of the New Testament, particularly the Gospels? Are there some thematic connections that we need to pay attention to? Because we're not just students of the academic side of the Old Testament, nor are we seeking salvation and justification through that law, but we're disciples of Jesus. I'll throw it out first, and maybe I'll turn around and answer it myself too.
Well, I guess just as far as a sort of an interesting theme that kind of runs throughout is the idea of sort of these two houses that he keeps coming back to. For example, in verse 2, he says that he brought the vessels of the house of God into the house of his gods. And throughout the book, there continues this sort of contest between these two houses. And of course, as we read, time and time again, the house of God comes out on top. But what's interesting about that to me, and we already talked about how Peter seems to pick up on so much imagery from this book, but how he talks about there in 1 Peter 2, about how we are these living stones that are built into this house of God. And so he picks up not only on this exile imagery, but then also in this house imagery that we're these living stones, just like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are these pillars in the house of God. And we are being built up into a spiritual house for God that will, just like the rock, grow and overcome the whole earth. But it's all built upon the rock and cornerstone, Peter says there, of Christ. So that's one interesting theme. I'm not sure. I think that gives us a helpful image. I'm not sure how immediately practical that idea is, but I think it's interesting to see how that runs throughout the book and then how Peter picks that up and runs with it in his letter.
I think there are two halves of Daniel, and one of the problems with what we're doing tonight is we're focusing on the first half. And I think that it's important to recognize that there are two halves. We need to read the first 6 or 7 chapters within the context of the whole book. If you don't, I think you miss a major point of the theology of the book, is that really there are two Babylons, I would say. One is a Babylon in which you have a chance of convincing the king you're a good guy. And you can affect change within the court. There's kind of this optimistic view of ability to have salvation now. We would call that kind of a realized eschatology. This is something where we can have freedom, safety, influence in the here and now. I can go to my congressman and affect the law on X, Y, and Z and do my duty as a Christian. That's the first half of Daniel. That's that Babylon. There's the second half, which is a very different Babylon. In fact, Babylon is so bad it's not even named. You have to speak in code. And kind of like we're having to talk about America right now. We got to be careful what we say. You know, it's apocalyptic. Salvation is not now. It is in the future. And anybody who thinks you're going to walk into a court and make any difference is naive, and you're likely going to get killed. And that's the apocalyptic portion of that. And I think that same it's a balance within the Christian life. The belief that one can live the Romans 13 life and honor authority and expect the government to wield the sword in defense of what's right and punishment of what's wrong, and also believe Revelation 13, that look, this world is deeply evil, and the forces of this world are ruled by Satan, and so are the kingdoms of this world, including the United States of America. And so this tension runs throughout Scripture, and I think that theological tension is a tension of the political theology of Christianity, where we believe that for every Peter who can stand up before the council in Acts 3 and 4 and 5 and make a difference, affect a Gamaliel saying, "Hey guys, we better be careful." There's a Stephen who tries to do the same thing and gets stoned, right? For every Paul that in Philippi says, "Hey, I'm a Roman citizen," they say, "Ooh, watch out." There's a Paul who stands before Agrippa and he says, "I'm a Roman citizen." They say, "Oh, you go to Caesar because you're going to die there." So I mean, there's this tension. And so I think what I would say is that we're talking about Daniel, and the question is how can we live faithfully in this world? Let's remember that the court tales here in the first half of Daniel are but half the story. And I think it's an important half that we hold on to and say, yes, we can influence. We can have be a positive role model. But if we lose the Revelation 13, if we lose the Daniel, second half of Daniel, then I think we lose an important reality within Scripture, that salvation is, yes, already, but it is not yet. And so that's a part of our life we have to recognize here in the U.S. as well.
I think that is an incredibly insightful way to look and how to balance and prioritize who we are. That in God's plan, the government, civil government, is to be a servant for him. When things always go wrong is when the government, instead of being a servant of God, decides it is God. And that's what happened. That's Nebuchadnezzar thinking he's the head of gold and has to be cut down to size. And that's also what happens in Revelation 13 when the beast expects to be worshipped. Or later in Revelation 17 when the great world city is called Babylon and does the same kind of thing. And I think in practical terms, like those of you who are freshmen and you're studying New Testament history and geography, are you in Acts at this point? What chapter about are you guys in right now?
17.
17-ish, something like that, 15, 17. What's really interesting is to study Paul's use of his Roman citizenship. He never uses it as an end, but he does use it as a means to an end, which is the glory of God and the spread of the gospel. And I think that we are sort of in like the Acts 16 era right now, where there is still some government protection that we can seek to protect our freedoms, but not out of some vague abstract sense of Americanism. It's for the sake of the gospel. And so I say let's use those privileges of citizenship as long as we can. Let's know that it's likely someday we may lose those. And then we're into Revelation 13. We're into Paul being willing to suffer. But whatever is going on, we're doing it for the glory of God and for the gospel.
I think going along with that, we have to be very careful because there are any number of people throughout history, including most prominently in the Bible, who are pretty sure that they are that good government, that good Romans 13, the one who are wielding the sword not in vain. I mean, it's exactly that approach that leads that same Sanhedrin to not just kill Stephen or, say, well, we should cool it with Paul. But, of course, to say it's better that one man should die than the whole nation be led into destruction. That it's that same group of people. I mean, not every single one of them, but it's that same approach that, well, we need to make sure that we protect our way of life. We need to make sure that we are protecting our interest because we know we're the people of God. And if we cease to exist, that Rome takes over, and they're really godless heathens. But of course, when you read the gospel story, and that same story can be read over and over and over again for Israel, is that the question, of course, is not just are we Babylon, but so often we're convinced we're Jerusalem. But ladies and gentlemen, if we are not the new Jerusalem, and therefore even Jerusalem is Babylon, and we have to be intensely careful when we think that we're the ones wielding the sword for God's kingdom, because you never see that in the New Testament.
Yeah. I think that's another interesting thing in the text that we need to kind of pay attention to right now. In the Old Testament and in the New Testament, everything we read in the Bible, every participant believes that their God is real, whatever it may be. Whether we're talking about the gods of the super awful pagan nations that surround Israel, or the gods of the Roman context or the Greek context. Everyone believes their gods are real because the spiritual realm to them is real. We struggle a lot in our sense of applying our faith, at least in my purview, of making that shift today, because we think we've got a lot of stuff figured out. And that figuring it out means, well, I know then that since Jesus is real and God is real, all these other gods are just mumbo-jumbo nonsense, and we erase the conflict of the spiritual realm from the text. Because here, this conflict isn't actually just about Daniel. It's not even about the kingdoms. This is the result of God demonstrating who he is to a people who forgot who he is. And so when they make their staged return back into the promised land, it's a demonstration of God's continuance for what he has on plate next. And everyone then still believes that their gods are real. And even Israel interacts with the nations around them with the purview that they see those people behaving as this is a real thing. And so if we can remind ourselves to make application, say, look, my God is real, but somebody else who doesn't follow Jehovah, the creator of all things, they don't see me that way. They see their God as being real and me being less. That will then help us refocus back to what the New Testament says is actually our fight. And our fight is not the one with our flesh and not the one with our hands. It's one that actually is heavenward focused. It's an extension of the simple phrase we repeat, lay up treasures in heaven. And fight to be part of the heavenward army, if you want to use those terms. Anything else from you guys in trying to touchstone on that or other things? We're getting close to a conclusion time that they'd like for us to try to pay attention to.
When's curfew tonight?
You said earlier it was like 10:15 or something.
We're in trouble.
I have no idea what those things are. They don't mean anything to me anymore.
What's the? My question is, what's the sin of Babylon chiefly?
Pride,
I think you're right.
rebellion.
Yeah. That comes up pretty consistently, doesn't it? And that's frightening to me. You realize that's the key issue with Babylon is its pride, and it's just kind of the source of evil. And what it results in, it results in Nebuchadnezzar, this kind of becoming like an animal. That's interesting, isn't it? Is that you kind of get debased in the way that you live and become more like the animal than the human. And you can see that within Babylon, I think.
And of course, that's just government. In our society now, big tech can do things that Nebuchadnezzar, the greatest monarch of his day time, could not even imagine being able to do. Yeah. And it just shows that any large human concentrations tend to be trouble. The first city in the Bible was built by Cain. Babel is a major city. And it's just a sober reminder to us that when you have concentrations of power like that, it truly does tend to corrupt. And all the more reason for all of us to be aware of many different, sources of power that can be a threat to our faith. But also to realize God's in control and to be faithful regardless.
Shane, are you saying that Facebook is a Tower of Babel?
Possibly.
All right, just making sure.
Possibly. It's more Twitter's more Tower Babel. I think Facebook's the Tower Babel for 65 and older. It would be my
Boomer babble.
Boomer Babel?
right. Boomer Babel.
Hey, Jared, could you categorize that for later? Make a little chart for us, a meme,
Sure.
like 6 memes to kind of explain it.
6? That's a lot of work.
I forgot you're lazy.
Very.
I think that's it for our discussion this evening. Is there more stuff we've got to do? Oh, someone sent me a message. I'm supposed to read things.
It was Jesse.
Well, I was trying to follow his rules that he applies in your class where he says, a preacher told me, when he doesn't want to mention my name.
And I name you every time, just like him. So.
All right, so actually Carson would like us to open up to questions. You guys good for that?
Sure.
All right, so the boss man said we want questions. So, peoples, questions, give us questions. We'll try to restate them for the live stream audience.
Back in the back.
Man in the back with a mask.
Will. You talked earlier, I used the word like assimilation, referring to Daniel and Joseph. In our Biblicon class, we use the word allegiance and how that was kind of a turning point and a problem when you're in exile. So my question to you guys is, how do you feel about, as Americans, pledging allegiance to the flag?
That's a good one. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go
No.
I'll be glad just to tackle that question. I think that Scripture talks about a sense of natural love and affection for certain things. Like I have a natural affection for my family. I have a natural affection for Winchester, Kentucky, my hometown. I have a great affection for the Kentucky Wildcats, the winningest college basketball program in American history. I have great affection for the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And I have affection for the United States. It's my home. It's a nation where I enjoy great blessings. So out of that love I have, which I think is natural and I think good, as all loves are when directed ultimately toward God, I love all of these things ultimately because I see them as gifts from God, different levels, different degrees, different blessings. And on that basis, then, I don't have a problem pledging allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God. That's, to me, the key phrase, which I don't think was even a part of the original pledge, and it was added.
1950s?
I think that's a good addition. And I think even as a Christian, so long as I understand that whether those words were in the pledge or not, that allegiance to a country is one of many sources of blessing that can be used for God's glory, I think that's fine. I think we all recognize and understand that patriotism has, through history, become the means through which people have been manipulated to think that they are showing natural affection for a blessing of God, and in reality just serving sources of power. And I'm sure that a lot of you who've had history classes about World War I in particular have seen pictures of the German belt buckles in which words that indicated they were doing this under God, serving God. So it's also one of the greatest forms of delusion to think that mindless patriotism is a form of love for God. But all loves properly ordered toward God, I think, are good blessings that we can be appreciative of. That's my opinion. I have nothing but great respect, though, for others who have a different way of evaluating those priorities.
I would just add, I think the question's a good one to ask. I appreciate you asking
Yes.
it. And I think that just for my part, this is a question, just so you know, the leadership team at Florida College wrestles with. And we do it out of this sort of awareness of Scripture and the tensions that we as Christians live in within the world. You may know, I trust you do, that here at the college, at the beginning of every year, we tell the students, everyone there, that if you choose not to say the pledge, you don't need to. It's a matter of, we believe, a conscience there, and we'd ask that you stand with respect for others who are. So I think that's one indication of recognition that, this is a question that we have. Where I view this is I view the pledge as an example of what we're told to do in Romans 13. And so I view a pledge as a statement of of submission, a statement of loyalty there. And I think that's what we're asked to do when we're told to be subject to the governing authorities. And so that's how I view that. But I understand others' perspective on that. So I think it's a good case study in this.
Yeah.
Since I think, the only person on the table who takes the other view, I probably should say something, and that is that I agree. I have no problems with people who have no problems saying the pledge. Look, I'm an American, and I love my country, just like I'm a Salts, and I love my family, and I'm an Alabamian, and love my state. And I'm sorts of all of other things that also have a pull on me and have requirements for me. And those are good things. They are important things. But for me personally, that I am beyond, and I agree with my brothers, and I think they would say the same thing, that first and foremost, they are a child of God and a citizen of a heavenly kingdom. And for me, this is a food choice. This is my not partaking of the king's table. And for a long time I wrestled with it. And I'd gone back and forth for years. But at the end of the day, for me, this was a chance to say, I'm going to not partake of the king's table because I had to make a decision somewhere. And I had noticed in myself feelings of patriotism turning from those good ones to ones that could very easily become the opposite.
Right, I'll look at it this way. Just because somebody on the news told you this is a big deal, it doesn't actually mean it becomes a big deal. As when I was your age, this particular issue was not a big deal. Many of the brethren who were students with me at school here did not participate in the pledge for all kinds of very healthy reasons, and some did. I continue to say the pledge on a regular basis, as part of the scouting unit that I'm part of, and that's my look at those things. So I think in the big picture of all of this, that's what we've got going on, is letting people maintain their identity and figure out those small details, rather than saying one size fits all, this is how you're going to have to solve this. Because just as it is with any other of spiritual development, what tugs on your heart might be different than what tugs on mine. And understanding that means I have to respond in a different way.
If we lived 150 years ago in the southeastern part of the United States, there is a very good chance you would have believed it was sinful for a Christian even to vote, because that was a very common view among Christians in the southeastern United States. And you can understand, after the war between the states and the terrible division and tragedy that caused, why brethren might choose that route. So this is definitely an issue where we get to practice what it is to love one another and to forbear with each other and respect each other, all trying to achieve the same objective, maybe with just different paths to get there.
Meat sacrificed to idols.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any other questions, follow-ons, other things? Other gentlemen in the back. Names are hard on me.
Clark.
Clark?
How do you think the concept of the two Babylons applies to the church? What is good and what is good?
So are you talking in terms, I want to clarify for understanding. The thing that goes good and bad, is that the church goes good and bad, or the culture?
Both, actually.
Okay.
Just like you have church divisions, you have people who choose to be ignorant or in some certain situations. Like there's a lot of preachers who fight against divisions in the church. They will be talked about, they'll be lied about, like to other brethren, and the brethren will take the side of the person who they know, rather than take the whole story. So, like, how do you kind of bring that perspective into view when the church is involved?
Well, I'll give my perspective on it really quick. We've got a little note that says, hey, 2 more questions max, and maybe I'll go more detail later. Look, here's the thing. People are people. And very often, people make choices on the basis of their bellies rather than on a basis of what's good. And I'll use this illustration. Pick any town, USA, any county, USA, and from a statistical standpoint, I will tell you straight, there's too many churches there. That's my opinion, reason from my experience. There's too many churches there for all kinds, and I'm talking about churches that maybe you or I would be comfortable visiting. I'm not talking about any church, like churches that you and I might be comfortable visiting. Because somebody's belly became more important than Jehovah. They made their belly their God. And that plays out in all those ways. But we can talk more about that in more detail if you want to, but that's my answer to it
Clark,
in a general sense.
That's a great question. And I would just say, in a way, it's not a hypothetical. I don't think it's hypothetical for you. I think you're thinking about real life things. If you look at the end of 2 Corinthians chapter 6, when Paul is revisiting the issue of idolatry, which he deals with in 1 Corinthians 8, 9, and 10, at the end of 2 Corinthians 6, he strings together a list of Old Testament quotations, many of which are addressed to the Israelites to come out from among them, come out from among idolatry. So almost like in Corinth, you almost see literal, Babylon. And what you see is Paul is still trying to work with them, So there's not going to be, as far as I know, any easy, pat answer. You also see in the letters of Jesus to the churches times where he indicates there could become a point in which he cuts them off. The main thing that I would want to encourage all of you is please do not be so demoralized when you see in your churches back home or where friends are, people act in ungodly, unchristlike ways. Do not be so demoralized you walk away from the faith together. Because as we've seen in 2 Corinthians, 1 Corinthians, Revelation, these were problems in the first century. And like Philip said, people are people. And you're not going to find a panacea where everything is okay until we get to the new heavens and new earth. So just realize in the here and now, these things happen. Don't let it demoralize you. I guess that's really the only quick, easy answer I can give you. Don't be discouraged. It's just a part of all of us trying to walk through this world.
Going on with that just a second, because of course it's great to say don't be demoralized, but I think we're all going to be. And what I would say...
That's very salty of you.
I know, right? But what I would say is that we, of course, my favorite example of this is what happens with Elijah. Elijah's demoralized, right? He has this incredible miracle of God. They kill the priests of Baal, and the very next second Israel's right back to acting the way they want to in 1 Kings chapter 18. But what I would recommend is don't give up on God, because Elijah doesn't. Elijah's depressed, Elijah's demoralized, Elijah feels terrible, but he runs to God. Because that's where he goes, right? He goes to Mount Sinai, he goes to Mount Hebron in 1 Kings chapter 19, and there he allows God to revive his spirit. And so when you will run into people being people, run to God. Because people will disappoint you over and over and over, but God never will.
And just one more thing to add to that. I think what's interesting is immediately after that, right, God does provide that remnant, which I think is so important to remember. In this, your question hits at very personal experience, because half of my family, that is the very reason why they left the church. And thinking, all right, I can have my own personal faith and not be a part of any specific group or church family. And all of them who took that route have fallen off the path. And it's because, first of all, they didn't run to God. And because of that, they never did find that remnant. And that's exactly what we see with Daniel, too. Just to tie it back into Daniel, a phrase that we will use a lot in cross country is the idea of running with the pack. You don't want to be stranded on your own in a race. If you get stuck in no man's land, it's going to be a rough race for you. You want to surround yourself with 3 or 4 individuals, and you can trade that lead and constantly give one another that momentum. And that's exactly what's happening with Daniel and these 3 other guys, that they go into Babylon and they find that remnant and continually trust in God, and they run with that pack, and because of that, they do stay on the path.
Yeah, to use a phrase that Ward uses a lot, and you've probably heard it since he's not here. He says, and I like this a lot, it's hard to be connected to the head if you're not part of the body. Being and finding a group of faithful people who can help you see God is absolutely crucial.
I think we have time for maybe one more question at this point, if there's another one. If not, you're more than welcome to corner any of us, well, mainly Salts, and ask your questions and, really dig into stuff afterwards. Any last question? Oh, there we go.
So we talked a lot about churches becoming unhealthy, and
That's complicated because people are complicated. But that's not the answer you want. So here's some things to think about that actually have a little bit of context to Daniel. Item number 1, diet. If you notice in the preaching that it shifts to the point where the preaching is angled downward intellectually, downward goal-focused wise, rather than to raise the maturity of the group, I guarantee you problems will happen. That's one option. What your diet is determines your future spiritually. So your preaching matters. And sometimes, and I can say this, because there's no consequences to me right now, the preacher actually is the problem. That means me, too. And that problem may be that the preacher isn't doing his work. He's lazy. He doesn't read, like actual books, and prepare well. But sometimes that's not the issue. Sometimes it's leadership or lack thereof. And so you can look at leadership and say very simply, hey, the people who are leading, and there's always somebody leading, do I look more like them? And is God pleased with that? If there's a Diotrephes, you give it long enough, you'll look just like that. Look at your elders. If you have elders in that congregation, give it enough time, you will and should spiritually look like that in time. So you can begin to see those things taking place. So like leadership, instructional part of that is leadership. But also on a real practical level, you can see the vibrancy of the congregation and the way it interacts with one another. Do people actually want to be there? Do you want to be there? You know if you want to be there or not. And so if you get to a point where either you or others seem like they don't want to be there, there's actually problems. You don't know the names of them yet. You don't know the symptoms and the root causes, but there really are. And there's a really simple barometer. If you have a gospel meeting, are you worried about bringing a non-believer with you to that meeting because you're afraid of what someone might say? That's not good. Like on just a real simple level. That's at least my quick answer to it.
I think one of the things that you see a lot in Israel is when what the people are at the temple is radically different than what they are all the rest of the week, that's usually a big sign of a huge problem. There's a disconnect. And it's when church attendance, church orders of worship become perfunctory and no longer God-centered, that then there becomes a disconnect between me and God. And once that gap starts, there's any number of things that can jump in there and exacerbate that gap. So I think keeping a real focus on glorifying God in all that you do and as the ultimate reason for what you do is a really key component in that. But it's a very open-ended question for sure. Good one.
Is perfunctory on your approved word list?
I don't know. Is perfunctory, everybody with me there? You're just doing it just to do it. How's that sound?
Maybe you want to yeet that one off the list.
That's right.
That's just for Coulter Wickerham right there.
That's precisely the only reason I said it. Seeing if there are no more allowed questions.
Let me just add one more thing on that. So one thing we haven't mentioned, I think it has a lot to do with money and how the congregation and the members of the congregation are using their money. I think with one thing our Lord taught us, it's that the how we dispose of our possessions is an important indicator of our disposition. And so, yes, there are things that we can do with our time and we can get away from things, but I think if we find that the congregation is becoming more wealthy and more money is being spent on ourselves than others, I think that's a sure sign that the congregation is in trouble. And so that is in trouble in a number of ways. One, it becomes a matter of us loving the world and serving mammon more than God. But two, it's a sign that we have become self-sufficient. We've become pretty reliant upon our own means. And usually that's the first step towards moving away from reliance upon God and God's Word. And time again, you see within churches, when you talk about, your question was, how do you know you're becoming unhealthy? What's the problem? Unhealthy teaching, unhealthy doctrine it follows upon a shift of priorities in how one spends one's wealth. I think that becomes a key, and that you could look down at church history time and time again. That becomes a key thing. So that becomes a pretty specific and uncomfortable barometer of looking at your checkbook, and the congregation doing a self-assessment in that way. That's I think a key thing for us to think about in America right now, because I think that's a driver of digression more than anything else.
Amen.
Good. Carson?
I hate to be the one to bring this discussion to an end, but I think we can all agree that tonight was really beneficial, and we learned a lot from it. I want to thank all of you for your time. This is something I know that's in the middle of busy schedules for all of you. Some of you have traveled here to be with us this weekend, but we thank you for your time. We thank you for the words you had tonight. We want you to know that all of you were chosen for a very specific reason and role in your influence on us officers. And so we appreciate what you do for us. We appreciate what you do, particularly for this school and for the people of it. I want you guys to know that Biblicon is not over just yet. 10 a.m. tomorrow. That's even waiting. 10 a.m. tomorrow, Jarrett Ferguson will actually be speaking.
Hey, Jared, look at you.
Type style class. We'll be here in Puckett at 10 a.m. And so, if you didn't hear enough of Jarrett tonight, come back at 10 a.m. tomorrow, and you can hear a message from him. I know you're excited to be here for that. What else do we got? Shirts. If you didn't get a Biblicon shirt because we sold out so quickly, thank you for that, by the way. I know Truth is very appreciative. You can go to Abraham. Abraham's in the back. You can sign up for one, and we'll be doing a new order next week. Also, keep Dr. Gordon in your prayers and support that he's been COVID right now. And we just want to say thank you all for coming, and thank you to those who were involved in all of this. A lot of work goes into Biblicon. The speakers, the AV team, marketing, the officers, the scripts, the diagrams for this. And so we just appreciate so much everyone helping out with Biblicon. It means the world to us as officers, but also we want to make a small impact for God. And so with that being said, Colin's going to lead us in a closing prayer, and then you're welcome to mingle with the speakers and to see out here by 12. Thank you, guys.
Let's all pray. Lord God Almighty, we come to you at this time. We're so grateful for the opportunity that you've given us this evening to sit at the feet of these teachers, Lord, to hear what they have to say about your word, Lord, and their experiences with it. We are so grateful to you for the bountiful wisdom that you've provided these men and their ability to impart that upon us, Lord. We ask that you have given us soft hearts this evening, Lord, to hear these words, to keep them and hold them close to our hearts, that we may learn from them and grow from them, so that we may properly serve you and properly grow as evangelists in this world, Lord. We know that this world, this earth, is a sick and dark, twisted place, Lord, and we ask that you give us the tools and the wisdom necessary to be stronger than Satan, Lord. Be stronger than the tempters of this world, to overcome our trials, to overcome our temptations, Lord, and to shine your light each and every day. We ask that you be with those at this time who are unable to be with us, Lord. They are sick with COVID or sick with other things, or traveling, Lord. We ask that you protect them and do your will upon them, Lord, whether that's healing them or keeping them safe. We ask that you continue to bless us through the rest of this week, Lord, and that you allow us to heed these words and to show them in our lives each and every day from here forward, Lord. We thank you for the physical blessings of this earth, and we thank you for the blessing of your Son, Jesus, and his sacrifice and what that means to us, Lord. And it's for his holy name that we pray. Amen.
Amen. I'd love to sit in here with you. Thank you for